Alright, here we are, part 2 of our discussion on the critics of the self-regulating model. Last video we talked a little about Keynes's model, where he looked at consumption, investment, and government purchases and focused on how the total of those, total expenditure, relates to total production or real GDP. And again, in his model, consumption was determined by disposable income and then also autonomous consumption, and then investment and government purchases are just constants that you're given. So you add those up and you get total expenditure. And then you compare the total expenditure to total production and you see whether or not the economy is in equilibrium. Again, the three possibilities: at any given level of real GDP, total expenditure can be greater than real GDP, total expenditure can be less than real GDP, or total expenditure can be equal to real GDP. So let's take a look at each of those. In the first case, if you have total expenditure greater than total production, so people are buying more than firms are producing, this means that inventories are falling, so firms will probably increase production and or prices. If total expenditure is less than total production, then you have the opposite. In this case, people are buying less than what firms are producing, so inventories start to bloat, so firms cut back on production and or prices. And then if they wind up being equal, total production equals total expenditure, then you're at equilibrium. So what firms are producing is exactly equal to what people are wanting to buy. Now, we showed the graph on this, the Keynesian cross. So as usual, with the lines cross, the total expenditure line and the total production line, that's equilibrium. So that's where we're moving toward. If you're away from that point, either producing more GDP or less GDP, then those forces we mentioned, inventory change, will move you back toward that equilibrium point. So we're always moving toward that point. Now, the key on this is that according to Keynes, where that equilibrium point is, that is where you're moving to. That may not be at full employment. So if full employment is $16 trillion, and where that equilibrium crossing point is $14 trillion, then the economy is going to move to $14 trillion. It's not going to move to $16 trillion. So there's none of that self-correcting stuff. You're going to move to the equilibrium wherever it is. So, and that of course ties back to unemployment. The unemployment rate, U, that is what it is today. What we want it to be is UN, the natural rate. And again, that's what it is at full employment. So whatever unemployment is at equilibrium, that's what it's going to be. It's not going to move to full employment by itself. So how do we then fix the problem? Well, according to Keynes, the issue is you need to change spending. So if you're in a recessionary gap, you need to increase spending to close the gap. Well, how much do you have to spend? You use the multiplier. So we talked about if you have, say, a $500 billion gap, then if you know the MPC, say it's 0.9, then you can use the multiplier formula to calculate how much will spending have to change to close that gap. And the multiplier formula we said is multiplier M equals 1 over 1 minus the MPC. Then what do you do with that? The next formula you know is change in real GDP equals the multiplier times the change in spending. So as long as you know any two of those three things, you can calculate the third. So if the MPC is 0.9, marginal principal consumed is 0.9, 1 over 1 minus 0.9 would give you a multiplier of 10. What that says is that for every dollar that spending changes, real GDP will eventually change by $10. What if the MPC is 0.8? 1 over 1 minus 0.8, that's 1 divided by 0.2, that's a multiplier of 5. So for every dollar change in spending, GDP changes by $5. You can see that as the MPC rises, the multiplier rises. And that's because the higher the MPC, the more money you spend. Remember, the MPC is the percentage of an extra dollar that you spend. So if it's 90, that means you spend 90 cents out of any dollar. That's more money. If it's 80, it means you're only spending 80 cents. So you're holding back more than money. So the multiplier is a very handy concept to use, saves a lot of time in doing those different examples. And that's probably a good point here on this video to stop. Again, Keynes's basic model: consumption, investment, government purchases. Consumption depends autonomous spending plus the changeable spending that's tied to your income. Investment, government purchases are simple constants that are added on. You look for GDP versus total expenditure and see whether there's a surplus of inventory or a shortage of inventory, and you know the economy is moving that way. You look for equilibrium, where the lines cross, where total production equals total expenditure. That's where the economy is moving toward. It may not be at full employment. And then how do you move to full employment? You change spending, and you let the multiplier then move GDP toward full employment. Alright, that'll stop us for now. Next time we'll look more at budgeting, deficits, and the debt.